Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre. Hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode, we discuss the horror genre, from books to TV to film and beyond. Sometimes, even from the beyond. You can find us online at terrorintandem.com and on Instagram at terrorintandem.
Hello.
I'm always on Instagram.
I
I'm
know.
just constantly gramming and Insta-ing.
You have so many Finstas.
I have Finstas,
Instas.
and Blinstas.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know when you're listening to this. Maybe you're going to listen to this in the fall, but guess what? Today's so hot.
Oh, it's a real blessing that this is just an audio-only medium because we are two piles of, like, melting flesh.
I don't know. I mean, that's perfect for the podcast.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, like, any Spaceballs fans out there, it's Pizza the Hut.
I don't know if you all know this about me. Some of you do, but I don't like humidity.
No.
And when the heat gets so high that it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Shade or not, you're getting cooked.
Yeah.
You're getting broasted.
Yeah, I like to do things, so these days make me feel like I am sort of trapped in an air-conditioned building.
See, I don't...
Luckily, air-conditioned building.
I don't like to do anything ever for any reason, so I'm fine with it.
Also, where we record, we have this door that we keep it mostly closed, but we have to keep it open enough so that our cat can go in and out. And just despite us, the crack that we leave open for her isn't big enough, so she has to aggressively open it wide. So she just did that.
I have a lot of respect for it, honestly. I have respect for the species in general because, as far as I can tell, thousands of years ago, cats just sort of decided they were going to latch on to humans and manipulate us into taking care of them for eternity. And just did it. They just literally moved in with ancient Egyptians or Mesopotamians, and they offer nothing. They're terrible.
Oh, that's
they're
not
monsters.
True. We love.
I'm a huge
sweet and snuggly.
Yeah, no, if
those moments that they give you snuggles or kisses or attention, it's makes up for all of their.
It always makes me laugh in a news story when it says the FBI seized this suspect's phone. I'm like, oh my god, if they took my phone, it would be just cat pictures and then a horror poster or something.
What I was going to say to you is it's interesting that you don't mind when pets tease you, but when people tease you, not so much.
Well, people are mean. Pets are funny.
So we're not going to talk about pets, cats today.
No, I mean, listen, anytime we stop making sense, just chalk it up to heat stroke.
We are going to talk about Stephen King again.
Yeah.
This is a part 2.
It's another recurring segment because we're so well established.
I know a lot of you were curious as to why the follow-up episode after our Stephen King part 1 episode wasn't Stephen King part 2. It's because we don't know how many parts we're going to make.
Yeah.
And
also,
this is part 2 and we wanted to spread it out.
Seriously, calm down. The threats are...
No, we want all of your attention.
Yes.
Well...
You're positive.
I'll let you know when it gets out of hand.
I thought that's what I was doing.
Well, it hasn't gotten out of hand yet.
No, it really hasn't.
You know,
Please
you've really
listen.
made it
Tell
once you
your
get a
friends.
stalker.
Please tell your friends. I don't want one of those. I'm barely comfortable with work acquaintances.
No offense, but you're too boring to be stalked.
Oh, I don't take offense at that at all. I mean, I'm flattered.
Be like, oh, my stalker fell asleep again.
That's what I'm saying. If I was ever under surveillance for any reason, I feel like the person assigned to me would need to be put on suicide watch.
So we're going to talk about Stephen King, where we left off in 1985. But we're going to start with 86 listeners. To 1999. And the reason I'm doing that is because there's something that happened quite significantly to Stephen King in the summer of 1999.
Oh yeah.
And we'll get to that. So I can start.
It wasn't me graduating from high school.
So by now, in where we are in Stephen King's career, he's an award winner. He's an award-winning writer.
He's a best-selling author.
He's a best-selling author. He's influencing writers like Haruki Murakami. who I absolutely adore.
Right, yeah.
And very strange. But he's still being written off by the horror community.
But this is the time when like young Duffer brothers are reading his books and like,
well, all of us young.
But like then they would go on to create, Stranger Things and but this is you're absolutely right. Like when I was looking at this list, this time period, this is when I started catching up to Stephen King, meaning like I had started reading him, but I was now I was reading his new books as they came out.
Same. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wasn't really catching up because I sort of caught him right at,
I was too young for his 80s
bragger.
I look, there are a shrinking number of situations where I can say I was too young. But I was too young back in the 80s to read Stephen King. So the 90s was where I really got into it. And then by the late 90s, I was like actively waiting for his new books to come out.
So we're here in the late 80s and the full 90s.
And that's for our younger listeners, that is the 1980s.
Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes in 1997 interviewed Stephen King and questioned his literary taste. Like, what does he read? So this is sort of pervasive where critics...
So she never read Dance Macabre?
Apparently not.
Leslie,
I doubt she read much his work.
I don't ever want to say anything against Leslie Stahl, but Leslie...
He's been written off at this point by both the horror community and literary mainstream. Because, he's not fitting in both.
Yeah,
why?
It's like...
Why do you have to write off such a talented writer is beyond me.
It's like gatekeeping in any community. Like when you get successful, then you're not cool anymore because people are reading you.
Yeah.
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
At this time, critics were referring to him as a rich hack and underplaying his creative genius by comparing him to the McDonald's of horror.
Wow.
I know.
Eat those fucking words.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
He humbly replied to all this criticism by saying he's doing the best with what he's got.
I've always appreciated that about Stephen King is, he responds well, I think, to bullshit criticism by engaging with it humbly. That's the best way to take the wind out of, I think we're all used to it nowadays of like writing something just to get a rise out of people, to create a false conversation, to make it seem like it's a big deal. So you just go on Twitter, you lob the dumbest thing you can think of out there, and everybody predictably goes crazy. But that makes it seem like it's a legitimate opinion or a big deal. Stephen King's always been really good at just deflating that right away.
Yeah. And
kind of just saying, what I do is pulpy.
Well, it's his life. He says if he wasn't a career writer, he would probably be dead. And he said he writes because he needs to. Like all of his prior addictions, all of his fears and insecurities come out with his creativity.
He's so honest in his writing, and he puts so much of himself into his books are like his Horcrux in a way. It's like he puts a bit of himself into each book. I think it's quite vulnerable.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty significant that we are in 2022 talking about a portion of Stephen King's written life in this way. Now we're in 1986 to 1999, and he's often said that his books and stories endure because of their hope. They give hope. He said that he believes in sappy romance, that kids are generally good, that good wins over evil, and that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And so he does have hope,
for sure,
in his works.
Not every Stephen King book has necessarily a happy ending.
No,
but it's quite rare that they have a bleak ending.
Right. Yeah,
it's rare for his books to have an ending that leaves you like, oh God.
Even the people within the novels that you root for are often, good.
There's a sense of closure.
Yeah. Around this time, also, he tried to emerge as a director.
Yes.
Dina De Laurentiis gave him a shot to direct his own story called Trucks and into the film Maximum Overdrive.
Starring Emilio Estevez and 900 tons of cocaine.
Yes, and he was on cocaine during this directing.
I think, actually, scientifically speaking, he was on all of the cocaine.
Yeah. So it didn't go well. I mean, mostly because of his drug abuse.
And we're talking about it this flippantly because Stephen King has been extremely open and transparent about this experience in his life.
Yeah.
He was high as shit the entire time, and watch any part of this completely bonkers and frankly terrible movie and it's no surprise.
Well, drugs give you a inflated sense of self, so he thought he could be a great director, and it turned out that maybe it's not such a good place to be right now.
First you get the coca, then you get the power, then you make Maximum Overdrive. That's the quote, right?
No.
From Scarface.
I don't think so.
Sometimes I like to quote Scarface. Yeah, it's an interesting time period for him because within this time period, he reaches definitely the apex of his substance abuse and then sobers up.
And we talked about that. We talked about the intervention that his family had.
Yeah.
And how,
Something I've always really appreciated from Stephen King is his emphasis and insistence, and he said this many times over and over, that quitting drugs and overcoming his alcoholism actually increased his creativity. He really fights against that very harmful and complete bullshit trope of all great artists have to have some sort of addiction.
Yeah.
He credits his sobriety with actually helping his writing, and the proof is in the pudding. I mean, my God, ever since the late 90s, not only has he been just as prolific as ever, but his work is truly diversified.
Absolutely. So, we're talking about this time frame, and we're going to go into sort of our favorites during this time frame.
Once again, that was really hard to do.
But not yet.
Because I think I've read just about every book he wrote during this time period. It was an extremely exciting time to be a Stephen King fan, as it is now, honestly.
It's about 20 books during this time frame.
Ooh.
And,
2 books
then
a
all
year.
of his other works that we previously talked about too. So you have that in your access. So
and half
typically
of these
with
books,
Stephen King is when you read him, you want to read more. And we are going to talk about interconnected.
The Pringles of horror novelists.
We're going to talk about the interconnectedness of some of his
the Kingiverse
settings and things like that. But
that's
if
one
you
of the
guys
things
can
I loved about reading his books was figuring that out slowly over time.
Or feeling you're in on it.
Yeah, because
you're in on something that
these
not
were the
everybody
days
is.
before, message boards on the internet, so you couldn't go and talk to a community about like this interconnected world he was building. It was just over a period of time reading enough books, you were starting to notice like, oh, I think these things are connected.
And whenever you meet like a big Stephen King fan, you can have that secret conversation.
Totally. Oh, yeah.
That somebody who's picked up a couple of his works wouldn't be able to have.
For sure.
So if you all bear with me for a moment, I am going to tell a very important story.
I would love to bear down for this story.
So in June of 1999, Stephen King nearly died.
Ooh.
I don't know if you all remember this.
I certainly remember it.
I remember it quite well.
Oh my gosh. It was like a where I was when it happened moment.
Yeah. So he and his family were at their lake house in Western Maine. It was a late afternoon, and Stephen King was finishing a daily 4-mile walk that he typically takes. He had just dropped one of his sons off at Logan Airport. He had come back to the lake house, and he's taking his constitutional.
Man, for real?
Yes.
Taking a 4-mile walk after driving from Maine to Boston?
He does that every summer.
But still, that's a lot of driving in one day, too.
He was carrying a book. He sometimes read it while walking, but not at this moment. He wasn't reading.
I do that sometimes, too. I always wonder if people think I'm weird.
They do.
Oh.
A light blue
mystery solved.
He was walking along a steep hill alongside a small highway, and a light blue minivan crested the hill and slammed into Stephen King head on, struck him off his windshield. He flew 14 feet in the air before landing on his side. He saw the bone of his right leg pointing in the wrong direction. The driver
I'd
of the
say
van...
anytime you can see the bone in your leg, it's pointing in the wrong direction.
Yeah. The driver of the van thought he hit a small deer, but found Stephen King's glasses on the front seat of his van, so he knew he hit a person. And he pulled over to the shoulder and went to King's side. His name is Brian Smith. He was distracted by his Rottweiler, who was trying to get food in the back of the van. He had a long list of driving violations prior to this accident, though.
Oh, good.
He had a suspended license, among other infractions. His brother Everett was a member of the local police station, and he was the first to report on the scene. So Smith pled only to misdemeanor charges. No toxicology or relevant eyewitness statements were collected, and he only served 6 months in county jail and a year suspension on his license. So
for nearly killing the most famous author ever.
King's lawyer worried that Brian Smith would sell the van that nearly killed Stephen King for a lot of money, so he purchased it for $1,500 before it could be sold.
Basically, one of the greatest moves by a lawyer ever. Yeah. Because there have been instances, I'm not going to bring it up on this pod because it's too depressing, but there have been instances where monstrous bastards have sold the instruments of their monstrosity and made money off of it.
And people buy it.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a certain motherfucker from Florida that did that.
Brian Smith died in the fall of 2000 on Stephen King's birthday. Now, if that didn't give you chills, if that isn't some sort of cosmic karma, I don't know what is.
I would say less cosmic karma and more the evil Zuni fetish doll that Stephen King crafted in his basement.
So that's like a perfect sort of resolution for somebody who nearly kills Stephen King. That's out of
Don't desecrate sacred grounds and don't hit Stephen King with your van.
That was out of a novel he could have written.
Oh, for sure. Are you going to talk about the van, though? About what happened with it?
In a minute.
Okay. Sorry.
But I do want to talk a little bit more about his injuries, because when I say he nearly died, I want you to really understand.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, it's horrific.
He had to be airlifted to a larger hospital than what he was initially taken to, because his injuries were like so grave. Then one of his lungs collapsed on the helicopter en route. He was in the hospital for about 4 weeks. He had 5 operations while there. He suffered a fractured hip, a mangled leg, which doctors nearly had to amputate, broken in 9 places, including an exploded tibia, lacerated scalp, 4 broken ribs, and a chipped spine, which was chipped in multiple places. If any of those chips had broken, he would be paralyzed. Misery-like injuries in his leg is what he said.
Yikes.
Later.
From the movie version. Because in the book, it's quite different what they do to Paul Sheldon's legs.
Yeah, but how mangled it was is what I'm saying.
God damn. God. Oh.
The first medic that arrived to the scene later commented that he's so lucky to have made it to the hospital, as the extent of his injuries have been death for others.
For sure. Yeah.
So the van that the lawyer purchased, I believe Stephen King's plan was to like smash it to bits with like one of those hammers.
Sledgehammer? Yeah.
But instead it was crushed.
Yeah. He did have it destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah. Which, man, therapy.
So I just wanted to let you know that when we go to our next episode, so Stephen King Part 3, we are going to talk about this accident.
Yeah.
And how it impacted what he produced during that timeline.
Oh, specific. I'm actually very much looking forward. Specifically, there's one novel I'm going to talk about from that time period that he wrote entirely on painkillers from the accident. And brother, it shows.
Yeah. And there are a few others that he was in the middle of writing that he finished while he was, recovering and going to physical therapy.
It was a defining moment in his life.
Absolutely.
Affected not just there was a frantic pace following this accident for about a decade where he was writing like there was no tomorrow.
Because there might not have been.
Exactly. Exactly.
So this, all to say that we talked about his early life and some of the horrors that he witnessed, and now even experiencing it all on his own. It does definitely imprint and have an impact on
Certainly.
creativity, but we are going to talk about all of the works up until the accident in this episode. But I wanted to sort of bookend it with that before we take a break.
It's important, I think, when we're discussing these people, to talk about them as people.
Absolutely.
Not lionizing, not denigrating, but just talking about them. I mean, I might lionize Stephen King a little bit.
But it's good to know that during this time, he was really being written off.
Sure.
The McDonald's of horror.
Yeah.
And now he had this significant accident, and
look at
he didn't die. But sometimes when artists die in a tragic way, they're looked back upon as more influential or more genius than they were. But we are going to make an argument that Stephen King's genius started from day one.
Oh, absolutely. And it's been more of a maturation and exploration over the years than changing necessarily.
We are going through it with him, with his works.
For sure.
We are seeing him evolve in different genres and different mediums.
But we'll get into the accident stuff next episode. Let's do the cocaine years.
Well, we're going to talk about our novels after the break.
All right.
Are you over the 50 Shades of Dull? Looking for a way to spice up more than just your sex life? Introducing H.H. Holmes' Home Dungeon Design, where we take the kink out of the clink. With H.H. Holmes' discreet and silent design team, we transform your once tantalizing sex dungeon into a terrifying, dungeon. If you've already satisfied your craving for masochism, why not redesign your space for maximum sadism? We will reimagine your space to allow for all of your darkest plans to come to life. Don't have a sex room to convert? Don't worry, we love a blank slate. With our 3D specs, we can show you all the horrors, nightmares, and tortures you can create with just a few modifications to your space. Need drainage? We have the latest drainage grading and high-flow power technology used by the military to clean their most stubborn messes. So make that call from the last payphone in your town and engage with one of our talented dungeon designers today. This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. We do not endorse nor condone kidnapping, torture, or murder, no matter how bougie your kill room is.
Thank you, sponsors. We appreciate your continued support of this creative endeavor with your fine products.
You don't have to do that every time.
And your fine deliveries. So I'm going to go first.
That's what we just said.
Yeah, but that was off mic.
Oh.
No,
You go first.
I'm going to go first because I decided it just now and it's not something we discussed. So I'm going to start with The Stand. Now, it's a little bit of a cheat because The Stand was actually published in 1978, but the complete uncut edition, which is what Stephen King considers the real version of the novel, was...
The uncircumcised version?
I was hoping you weren't going to make that joke.
Really? Oh.
So
how could I not?
The Stand floppy foreskin edition is in 1990 he released an expanded and updated version of the book that he considered to always be the version that he wanted to release. In 1978, Doubleday was his publisher. They forced him to cut almost 500 pages from the book, saying no one's ever going to read a book this long. Well, fast forward to 1990, no one is saying no to Stephen King anymore. So the book originally took place in 1980. He switched it to take place in 1990. He updated some of the cultural references, and he just threw back in a lot of characterization and a lot more plot. Now, this is, I think, his longest novel. It's about 1,200 pages long, I believe. It's a tome, and it's worth it. It is a classic for a reason. Just a real brief synopsis of it. It basically it starts off with this character escaping from a biolab with his children. And you never really see that character again, but the fact that he's escaping and breaking quarantine is not great. So he ends up spreading this super flu that is nicknamed Captain Trips in the novel. It's a virulent influenza that kills like 99% of the population on Earth.
Can I admit something?
Yeah.
I have not read The Stand.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's an undertaking. Like I said, it's a real big one.
It is nearly as long.
Yeah, it is.
And I've read quite long books before.
Oh, I didn't mean to imply that it was...
No, I know. It's not that it's an undertaking. I don't know why I've never read it. I just haven't.
Well, I'll try not to spoil too much because...
Okay. I mean...
I'm not making
like 30 years ago.
I'm not making this claim lightly. It is one of his best books, for sure. It's not just one of his...
I feel like I wouldn't be able to be a true fan if I'm not reading every book.
You
eventually.
should read it. You definitely should. It's worth it. It's definitely worth it to read. It's one of his best books, but it's also it's a classic of the sort of post-apocalyptic genre. I know that's a pretty overplayed now, but keep in mind this was written decades ago.
I know it definitely had influenced Justin Cronin's trilogy.
Oh God, it's had an influence on so many. Everything from Cormac McCarthy's The Road to really just take your to 28 Days Later, Outbreak. It follows a long line of stories like the Andromeda strain of super viruses that kill everybody, and
the reality show in which we live in.
Yeah, you'd think
the coronavirus.
You'd think all of us spending our lives reading these books and watching these movies would have been better prepared, but alas,
they are a fiction.
So, The Stand is the superflu kills off most of the population, and it follows different characters from across the country in different places as they all start to have dreams. Now, they're dreaming of two people. Randall Flagg, the traveling man, who's the man in black. He's the chief antagonist, sort of a supernatural Lucifer-type being, walking towards the final battle that's going to take place after most of the people have died. So think of it like most of the people dying is the rapture, and they're gearing up for the final battle, like in the Bible. They're also dreaming of a 108-year-old African-American woman named Mother Abigail, who's telling them to come to her, to gather, that something's coming. So it follows some really memorable characters: Nick Andros, Tom Cullen, Larry Underwood, the Trash Can Man, as they sort of go through their separate adventures and then meet up with each other. It's just... That's about all I'm going to say, really. It all builds towards a really cool ending, and Randall Flagg is a character that shows up in a lot of Stephen King's fiction.
Yeah, the name is definitely familiar.
I'm going to spoil it. It's not really a spoiler because Stephen King has said it many times. Randall Flagg is the man in black from the Dark Tower. Mm-hmm. He's Martin Broadcloak. He's in Insomnia. I mean, he's an antagonist. He's connected to Pennywise. There are so many threads throughout Stephen King's books connecting each other, but Randall Flagg is someone that shows up a lot. But so this book is like part apocalypse story, but it's also that Stephen King style of American folktale of truckers and the highways and byways of America being like arteries of this country. And Neil Gaiman does that kind of thing a lot when he writes about the London Underground, or just literally underneath London. So yeah, it was adapted into a pretty decent miniseries in 1994 by Mick Garris. Had Gary Sinise and Rob Lowe and Molly Ringwald. Ed Harris, Ray Walston was in it, which was cool. My favorite Martian. And, of course, Ruby Dee as Mother Abigail was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, we'll have definitely an episode on...
adaptations, you think?
Yeah.
This was a good one. Read the book.
Fiction
the book is
to films,
far superior.
we absolutely are going to have so many episodes. Things that he's been in, things that he's been involved in, and things he hasn't been.
I want to admit that I haven't seen the new adaptation, the one with Alexander Skarsgård and what's his name? A bunch of other people. Whoopi Goldberg is Mother Abigail in that version. I don't know.
I don't like putting out these faces to read the characters.
That's true.
It's a little troubling.
Sometimes
I want to envision.
Yeah,
who I
sometimes
want
when
them
you
to
watch
be.
something before you've read it, you put the actors into the book, and there are differences in the descriptions. But I don't know. Having read the book, having seen one adaptation, I think I'm all set. But listener, if you're going to do just one thing, just read the book. It's a real. I know it's long, but it's very fast paced. It's a page turner. It's grand. Lots of characters. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, you can handle lots of characters.
Yeah,
and it's got all of the heart of a good Stephen King novel. So just one last thing I want to say about The Stand is Stephen King talks about this in his nonfiction, especially in Danse Macabre, where he says, if you write one page a day, at the end of a year, you'll have a novel. Just think about it like that. Don't think about the daunting task ahead of you. Just sit down and write. So when he started writing the novel, The Stand, it began as him trying to write a fictionalization of Patty Hearst and the SLA. And he was really struggling. Couldn't get this daydream out of his head of the traveling man, of Randall Flagg, it turned into The Stand. So just keep putting pen to paper, everybody, and even if what comes out isn't what you expected, it might just be your magnum opus.
awesome. Well, I have always been interested in reading it.
I hope you do. I really do. I having known you for some time, I think you'll like it.
As much as I can be known.
The mystery, the mystique that is my co-host.
Speaking of being known, I'm going to talk about my first, which is Misery.
Oh, wow. So good.
So Misery is one of my favorite Stephen King works. Just a brief synopsis.
That's no surprise to me, honestly.
Yeah.
It does hit all of your your buttons.
Oh, yeah, it does. It's about a writer who is in prison and tormented by a psychotic fan.
Stephen King writing about a writer?
Yeah, the writer must give in to the kidnapper's request. It's an inward-facing book. It's a psychological thriller. Very minimal characters, but it is really a character study. The author of Victorian romance novels, Paul Sheldon, is in a serious car accident, and he's found by a former nurse, Annie Wilkes, and she cares for him. He believes that she's like his angel caretaker, but he realizes very quickly that he is a prisoner. The title itself, Misery, has a couple of meanings. One is that the heroine of Sheldon's romance novels is named Misery Chastain.
Misery Chastain cannot be dead.
And the state that Paul's experience is misery itself.
Yeah. One could characterize it as such, yes.
So basically, Annie Wilkes is pissed because the latest Misery novel is the final in the series is called Misery's Child, and Misery is killed. His intentions to move on to crime novels, and so she basically imprisons him in her guest bedroom, won't take him to the hospital, gets him all addicted and hopped up on painkillers, and she uses these painkillers as a way to manipulate him. So when he's struggling and he needs to call his agent or call someone or like get out of the room, he becomes so desperate with needing a painkiller that she'll say, well, I'll do it if you write a chapter.
Yeah, she really plays, she gets him addicted, and then she basically enslaves him. She
has like these crazy outbursts out of nowhere. She makes him write a new book called Misery's Return, in which he will continue the series and make sure that Misery lives on. So as he starts to write this new book, when she leaves, he begins exploring the house while she's gone. Very intense. This is an extremely intense book because it's really about what happens when he gets caught, because he does get caught snooping. One of the things he discovers is that she's essentially a serial killer. She kills a lot of people.
Yes.
Um,
but
and
always like making it seem like she had to.
right. Yeah. Like it was,
I
she had no choice.
I had no choice.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So essentially he gets caught. She takes an axe and chops his foot off and then cauterizes it.
What she calls hobbling.
Yes. Which then keeps him trapped for even longer. And so this novel touches on the psychological horror and self-flagellation of a writer. Paul has to create a story that he doesn't want to tell, and the story takes a hold of him, and as he begins to tell it, he has to finish it. So that's like the curse of the writer. Annie represents both a jailer and a muse and the ultimate critic and fan. And she punishes his failures by literally cutting pieces off of him.
Yeah, she's toxic fandom.
Yes, that's what he's notably said. It's a representation of, Annie is a representation of cocaine and a representation of the parallel between toxic fandom and celebrity.
Annie, get your 8-ball.
And the metaphorical chaining that King feels to the horror genre.
Well, yeah.
So that's part of why I've sort of talked about how he's typecast, how everybody sees him, how they reduce his genius to, you know, like just a rich, whimsical writer, that he is metaphorically being chained as a horror writer. And as we go through this decade plus of writing, you will see that some of his works are starting to poke through that typecast.
This Misery is also famously one of the best film adaptations of a Stephen King work.
Which we will absolutely talk about.
Kathy Bates, I believe, won the Academy Award
Yes.
for that. Yeah.
Well, she was, yes. I believe she thanked him in her acceptance speech. It's a very well awarded work. It's very critically acclaimed, the writing. And it's an amazing story. And it's not one of his longer books.
No. And it's self-contained. It's not
Yeah.
a series. It doesn't connect to things. It's a one and done.
If you've never read Stephen King and maybe all of the other
And you're
start
not into
here's,
like ghosts and goblins and shit.
yeah, you don't believe in sci-fi or that bothers you about suspending disbelief, read this.
Yeah.
It's a really accessible, if you like true crime. I mean, this is true crime right here.
I don't know if you came across this when you were researching it, but it's extremely similar to what happened in real life with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the character of Sherlock Holmes.
No.
Well,
I did not know that.
So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the rare writers who was hugely famous while he was alive. He was a celebrity. And that began to really weigh on him because all he could write were Sherlock Holmes stories. It's all people would read. They demanded it of him. So he quite famously killed off Sherlock Holmes in a short story where he was battling Dr. Moriarty, and they fell over the side of Niagara Falls and to their deaths. And people went bananas. Now, I know sometimes we think that the internet created toxic fandom. It didn't. It just amplified it.
It made it easier to
it made it easier.
find.
So back in the day, you actually had to show up at Sir
celebrities.
Arthur Conan Doyle's house to threaten him, which is what ended up happening. He was getting a lot of death threats, so he wrote like a half-assed story where he basically was like, yeah, fuck it, he survived. He's alive again. Yay. And people were happy. And that always, when I was reading Misery, that I always thought of that story of like, that's the strangeness of the relationship between the fan and the creator. The creator owing their livelihood to the fan, but
And they do feel the connection as an appreciation for their work, but not necessarily like a friendship.
No.
And the fans think that, oh, they're my friend.
It's
them.
like the concept of patronage during the Renaissance is, giving an artist money to create. That doesn't mean you get to tell them what to create.
Mm-hmm.
You're giving them space and freedom to create, and you have to accept what is created.
And it's also hard to separate fans that are truly fans and respect the celebrity and the ones that aren't there for the right reasons.
I think Jason Momoa said it best when he was talking about doing the press tour for Aquaman or Justice League or whatever, and he said the problem ones, the really intense fans, it's never kids or anything. It's always like a middle-aged man with a lot of loud opinions.
Or a woman.
No, he said it's always a middle-aged man.
Maybe for him, but not for celebrity.
No, for sure. So my next one is It, published in 1986. Most of us probably know Pennywise the Clown, especially lately, since the recent adaptations by Andy Muschietti. But essentially, it takes place in the fictional Maine town of Derry. Now, Derry does show up in a few other Stephen King works, but this is the primary one.
In some of my recommendations, too.
Yeah. Now, in the novel, it takes place, like the movie, in two different time periods. But in the novel, the first time period is in the 1950s. A group of kids who are kind of social outcasts, they form a group that they call the Losers Club, because they're all losers, they're not the cool kids. They group together and, they become friends and also fight an ancient evil in the form of the scariest fucking clown you've ever seen in your life. Now, Pennywise terrorizes the town. He's this ancient being that feeds off of pain and fear and hate. So much like the Catholic version of Lucifer, he's a rabble-rouser in that he incites the worst instincts of humanity and then feeds when we tear ourselves apart. But Pennywise also likes to jump in there and get his hands dirty too. So, not getting too deep into it, the kids, they fight Pennywise in the 50s. Then they go off and they lead separate lives. And what they kind of discover later is the further they get from Derry, from their hometown, they forget. They literally forget all about Pennywise, each other. It fades from their minds. The only person that remembers is the one of them that stays in Derry. So,
and he's not always around.
No, Pennywise goes into these cycles of hibernation and killing. So the second part of the book takes place in the 80s, and Pennywise is coming out of this 32-year cycle, almost like a locust, to feed again. The group starts to have dreams, and one of them, Stanley, kills himself. And that brings them back to Derry, where their memories come back. They reforge their relationships, and they fight Pennywise as adults. Yeah. Not all of them make it. It's quite sad. Now, the book is another massive, massive tome. It's over 1,000 pages.
And It is the real name of Pennywise. Well, that's what the name is. That It and Pennywise.
Yes, Pennywise.
It is Pennywise?
Pennywise is the antagonist, but
Pennywise is Robert Gray.
Pennywise is just the name of the clown of the latest incarnation of this, what turns out to be an ancient cosmic being that's been around for countless thousands of years. Pennywise is just sort of it put on this persona and this avatar because it noticed that people are afraid of clowns and it likes its prey to be scared. I guess it makes it taste better.
And he wants to prey on humans. He needs to feed on humans,
yes,
especially children.
There's a light inside of them.
He gets strength from fear.
Now the book's been adapted twice. Once in 1990, a TV miniseries by Tommy Lee Wallace, who fans of our podcast, and really, why wouldn't you be a fan of this podcast, might remember from our episode talking about Halloween. He was the creator of the Halloween shape mask.
Oh,
yeah, he's a visual effects guy. Also director. He directed one of my favorite Halloween entries, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Often maligned, unfairly so, I believe. But it had a really great cast. I mean, it had people you didn't expect to be in a horror movie, like Harry Anderson and John Ritter, R.I.P. to both of those kings. Two people who were, primarily known for their sitcoms and their comedies, right? Night Court and Three's Company. So, to have them in this in a horror show, and it was really cool. But honestly, when you think of the 1990 version, it's Tim Curry as Pennywise. Tim Curry as Pennywise is unbelievable. He is
unbelievably great.
He's so terrifying.
Scary too.
He is campy and clownish and over the top and very Tim Curry.
It's like what you would invite a clown to a party.
Yes.
And you would get this psychopath.
over the top clownish bullshit of like, oh my God, this is so lame. But there were some, man, I am still afraid of his adaptation of Pennywise. Now, more recently made into 2 films by Andy Muschietti, starring Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise. Also
very good.
Incredible
Just different,
job.
but
Very different adaptation. Yeah. Tim Curry played him more like a human being a clown, where Bill Skarsgård was like clearly supernatural from the start. There were elements of Tim Curry's performance that were like more... he clearly wasn't human. He was a monster and supernatural, and they showed that in the show, but this might have been some limitations of the budget. They played him much more as like a person-looking clown. In the movies, there were a lot more effects. He does a lot more monstrous stuff. He turns into different things because, you know, they had the money and they had the effects to do it. So a few differences I just want to point out. Now, much like Misery, Misery the Misery the movie is very intense. Misery the book is 10 times more hardcore. It's really... there are some moments in that are real tough. Annie Wilkes is much more hardcore in the book. Now, the book It is similar. There are a lot of concepts that are wild in It, the book. A lot of cosmic, philosophical, psychedelic explorations that are just not explored in the movie because I'm not sure they translate very well to film. You know, the great cosmic turtle is not mentioned in the movies. And probably most infamously, the sex scene is not in the movies because they're kids, and that's hard to film. Something I did want to say: this book, a lot of it deals with characters that are adolescents, and they go through horrible things. They are brutalized. There's sexual content. There's violence, graphic violence, and that can be very, very difficult. The thing is, though, that happens to real kids. Real children in real life go through horrible things all of the time. And I think it's disingenuous when we pretend otherwise. I mean, it's perfectly okay to say kids should be kids and we should protect children. But I don't know. It's not honest when you are talking about kids and you shy away from anything unpleasant. Stephen King really... He doesn't infantilize his childish characters. He puts them into adult, difficult situations. Yeah, so I know I didn't talk about the book too much because I really figure that the broad strokes of the plot are out there. And the thing is, if you've seen any of the adaptations, if I talk about the book, it's really going to give it away. Just know that it is one of my top recommendations. It is maybe one of the scariest things I've ever read in my life. And there's a reason we're all afraid of clowns, and that's largely because of Stephen King and this book. Check it out. It.
Awesome. So my next is just a short story called The Langoliers.
Oh, shit. Right.
From 4 Past Midnight, which is a collection of 4 novellas. It came out in 1990. So The Langoliers essentially tells the story of 10 people who fall asleep during a red-eye flight from LA to Boston. And when they wake up, the plane's deserted. There's no pilot. So fortunately, there's a pilot on the plane. His name's Brian. And he lands the plane in a odd place, but it ends up being Bangor, Maine.
Which is an odd place.
The airport's completely deserted. No passenger on the plane left understands what's going on. Except for a banker, this investment banker who is a complete sociopath. He tells them that these creatures his father used to scare him with have finally come for him. So the first half of the Langoliers essentially is all the people freaking out and figuring who's going to land this plane. And then the back half is them in this death zone with these creatures that are coming to get them and they have to survive. So the goal is really to outrun them. What these creatures represent is time. That's really the bottom line.
Like allegorically?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can't outrun time. When it's your time, it's your time. Stephen King said Langoliers came to him when he had an image of a woman pressing her hand over a crack in the wall of a commercial airliner. He couldn't get that image out of his head, and then when he was lying in bed one night, it came to him. He realized that she was a ghost, and then he wrote the whole story the next day.
Wow.
So,
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the adaptation of it, but Bronson Pinchot plays the banker.
Yeah.
In that, tearing up pieces of paper.
So that's just one of the novellas. The other one that you can check them all out, obviously, but the other one is called The Sundog, and that's a really amazing novella.
Is that the one about the camera?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really good.
So check it out. It's just a short novella in a collection, and I think you'd really like it. It's definitely frightening, tense, and I just wanted to mention it because I like to mention some of his shorter work sometimes.
And any fans of Lost?
Absolutely.
You know, it's very similar. A plane ending up in a strange dimension or whatever.
Yeah, and I mentioned Yellow Jackets the other day as well.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
You know, it's got that vibe for me, which is why I definitely was drawn to it.
Awesome. My last one is it's a little bit of a cheat, but I'm going to wrap 3 in 1 here. So in this time period, he released books 2 through 4 of the Dark Tower series. Now, I mentioned the Gunslinger in the first Stephen King part because, man, I just love the series. So he's now the Gunslinger is a short novel, and it's very tight. It's very contained. It all takes place in the desert. It really blew up and expanded in the second novel. That's where it started to become this epic. Now, the second novel is called The Drawing of the Three. That was published in 1987. But it only takes place mere hours after the ending of the first one. So at the end of the first book, he catches up with the Man in Black and has his tarot cards read. He wakes up in the second book on a beach, and immediately he's attacked by these monsters, these lobster creatures. And I remember reading this because in this moment, he's maimed. And Stephen King takes this badass killing machine mythical hero character and maims him and hobbles him in the opening of the second book. And it blew my mind because he was he was vulnerable. He wasn't the unstoppable Terminator that he was, in the first book. And it was just an incredible narrative decision. And I remember at the time being like, I can't believe it. You don't take someone as badass as Roland Deschain and like make them, give them this disadvantage. That's just not something you do. But so what that forces him to do is he's confronted by 3 doors, each representing one of the tarot cards that he was read. He steps through each of the doors in turn and is transported to a different time and place on Earth. So he's traveling from Midworld to Earth. One door takes him to the 80s where he meets Eddie, the prisoner, who's a drug addict and a low-level criminal with a heart of gold kind of character. Another door takes him to the 60s where he meets the Lady of Shadows, Odetta, who is a woman who is in a wheelchair. She's African-American, civil rights leader, and she also has dissociative identity disorder, has a second personality named Detta, who is violent and angry. And the third door takes him into the body of Jack Mort, the Pusher, who is actually not going to be a member of his team, but is the person we find out injured Odetta and took her legs by pushing her in front of a subway train, and is the one who killed Jake, the companion from the first book.
Huh.
So Roland enters into his body, prevents these things from happening, creates a massive time paradox, goes back to Midworld with Eddie and Odetta, and they form their fellowship called the Quartet. And they go off on their journey from there. I'm not going to give any more of the book away because I feel like I've already given a lot away there. But that was followed up in 1991 by The Wastelands, which found the group going back one more time to get Jake, to finish completing their fellowship. Now, the time paradox that Roland created by killing Jake's killer before he could do the deed means that Jake is now living kind of dual realities, and on Earth he's going crazy.
Oh.
So Roland sort of rescues him. They come to an unpassable, irradiated part of Midworld after fighting a giant cyborg demon bear that is awesome. And they end up riding this demonic, insane, sentient train called Blaine the Mono through a nightmare wasteland on their way to the Dark Tower. And it's really cool. It's really evocative. They don't tell you flat out what happened, but they do hint that it was a catastrophe worse than nuclear war. And everything is poisoned and dying. But
it's very like talismanish.
It is. And the
because
standout,
they share that sort of world.
The standout here is like if Tommy the train, the tank, and what is it? What's that?
Thomas.
Thomas the train. Yeah, it's kind of like if that were darker.
In the Upside Down.
Yeah, basically. Or how we all suspect Thomas really is when the cameras stop rolling. And then to round it out, in 1997, he gave us Wizard and Glass, which is the fourth book in the series. In the present of the quartet's journey, they come upon a storm called the Tinny, and that forces them to hunker down, and Roland tells them a tale of his early days. So he tells them of his first mission, of his ascension from apprentice to a gunslinger, and the brutal rituals and trainings, and talks about the death of his mother, his first love, things like that. It's a prequel that came out 2 years before The Phantom Menace. So once again, Stephen King blazing that trail. The thing is, it really has a Lord of the Rings and Wizard of Oz feel to it. He really mixes in a lot of
fantasy and sci-fi.
Well, no, literally Wizard of Oz. They go to a place called the Emerald City. Like he mixes in real Earth mythology into Midworld's reality, but it's all from a distant future where this stuff happened thousands of years or an indeterminate time before, and everything's ruined now. And like, so it's very strange and it's very psychedelic and really cool. But it's like, it definitely has a Lord of the Rings gathering vibe on an epic quest that seems doomed. But Wizard and Glass was, it didn't move the present story, but it filled in a lot of interesting characterization, especially for Roland, and really upped the stakes. The thing is after this, he got into, Stephen King was in that horrible accident you talked about. And I remember having a very shameful thought, that I'm not proud of, oh my God, is he going to finish the Dark Tower?
Yeah.
And after he recovered, he did within a few years. And he did say the accident kind of spurred him to realize he needs to finish this series that he began in the 1970s.
Let's just be glad his head was okay.
Listen, these are great books. They are very Stephen King, but they're not quite like his horror novels. If you've
liked The Talisman or read it since I recommended it.
If you're looking for for fantasy that isn't necessarily like your Tolkien or your Dungeons and Dragons tropes, it's a little different. Man, The Dark Tower, I can't recommend it enough.
Like back in, the Excalibur or Once and Future King, those types of dark
it's like
fantasy.
If Robert Browning wrote The Death of Arthur while on opium, that's kind of what it feels like.
I'm surprised he didn't. So my last, and a perfect bounce from yours, even though the last one was
perfect
after this one.
So perfect.
Insomnia.
Oh, yeah.
1994.
Yeah.
So this was also set in Derry, Maine. And just a little brief about Derry, the fictional Derry. It holds like this interdimensional conduit into the multiverse or the microverse that Stephen King has created. So this type of chaos is something that happens quite often in Derry.
Yeah, it's like a place where the veil is thin.
Yes. Ralph Roberts is the novel's protagonist, and he's a retired widow who gets increasingly dangerous insomnia. It's called sleep maintenance insomnia, and the break in sleep allows him to see auras and other things about people. that they're hiding or that's like sort of spiritual and supernatural. And the novel sort of begins with Ralph coming into contact with one of his former acquaintances named Ed, who also can see these auras, but he's not acting right. He's not acting like his self. He's sort of angry and dark. He also finds out that his friend Lois can see these and interpret them, see these auras and sensations and interpret them.
Hey, if I don't get sleep for long enough, I can see auras too.
He also sees these white coats that he calls little bald doctors. So they become a pretty significant piece to this puzzle. What's interesting to me is that the white doctors call themselves by the three fates in Greek myth, or the Moirae. One is Clotho, who spins the thread of life. The other is Lachesis, which measures the thread that is spun on the needle, which determines how long you're going to live or your destiny. And these powers allow them to control who's born and decide who could be saved and or put to death.
Well, that takes the pressure off.
Sure. Right. It's all a fate.
It's just three blind Greek ladies.
Correct. So these doctors essentially free people from life when their time is pass away. They make like sort of a nice journey into the next, the nothingness. The third of these sisters, these fate sisters, although I think they're little bald doctors, I think they're genderless, honestly, is Utropau. So Utropau is the eldest of the sister and chooses which manner of death to end the lives of mortals by cutting that thread. But in the book, Utropau is rogue, and they enjoy the disruption of a premature ending, a violent ending. They get sort of enjoyment out of it. So this book is very supernatural. It contains a lot of higher dimensional shape-shifting. There's a Crimson King that's part of this.
Dark Tower fans take note.
Yes.
The Crimson King.
Who feeds off of fear and grief. And the Crimson King teams up with Utropau, who takes over Ed. So remember I mentioned Ed not acting right?
Yep.
He's sort of being embodied by this darkness and this the violent and chaotic side of fate.
Maybe you're hangry, maybe you're possessed by a Greek fate.
So essentially we find out that Clotho and Lachesis are the ones that gave Ralph and Lois insomnia in order to give them the perception of a higher reality so that they can defeat the bad.
Talk about the cure being worse than the disease.
Right. Gon shows up. He's the godhead from the Dark Tower, and he's also the godhead that gives those mystical elements throughout Stephen King's works, like the talisman, its power and its energy.
Yeah.
Ralph ends up being a hero, and he and Lois work with the Bald Doctors to continue their good work. So that's sort of how the novel wraps up. But there are a lot of Dark Tower nods within the book. Roland Deschain shows up, and the Green Man. Connections to it, specifically Derry, but some of the characters as well. Pennywise is mentioned several times, and it's thought that the Crimson King, who's the antagonist of this piece, and it are the same entity. Never confirmed or denied by Stephen King. Never denied is the important part of that sentence.
And the readers of The Dark Tower will know the fate of the Crimson King by book 7.
Patrick Danville is saved by Ralph in the novel, and the little bald doctors call him someone of cosmic importance, and he makes an appearance in The Dark Tower. I mean, a pretty big one.
Yes, he does.
So abortion is also a very big theme in this book. The focus isn't on abortion specifically. It's more focused on the extremism around the argument of pro-life and anti-abortion.
You mean anti-choice?
Or anti-choice. I mean,
Yeah.
then it was anti-abortion, but we've now changed the terminology
Yeah.
recently. And so it sort of emerges that the position of a pro-choice is more of a balanced take. So it does show the extremism of both of those that I mentioned, the pro-life and anti-choice stances.
He explores extremism, especially from a American religious kind of point of view, a lot in his work, in The Mist, for sure.
But it's interesting to see how the different fates work with these characters within the novel.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of the more out there books.
Oh, for sure.
Because it is grounded in on Earth. It's not in a multi-dimensional place. It's not a fantasy. This is just a regular widow and woman who are trying to help defeat this chaotic death monster that's traveling around.
So maybe a little supernatural then.
No, what I'm saying, not fantasy.
Yeah. No, it's not like
It's
elves
grounded
and orcs
on
and shit.
Earth,
Yeah.
so it's going to cause you to suspend your disbelief and like just go with the story.
I
really quite like this book.
Yeah.
I know that it's probably not a lot of people's favorite, but I always enjoyed it. I thought it was a really well imagined, very different than
And that's cool
some
that
of his other works, because these are older characters,
That's
elder
true.
characters.
And as connected as it is to his other works and as many Easter eggs as there are, you got a lot of enjoyment reading it without having read those other works, like The Dark Tower.
Absolutely. I didn't need to have the Dark Tower context.
Yeah. It's
in
more
order
like if
to
you have read
enjoy
it,
this.
then, you get a little extra nod.
And then the characters of the book, they're on their second wave of life. They're not going through this as children or young adults. It's sort of they're getting this special power as they're going through and towards the end of their life, which I always thought was really interesting as sort of a last responsibility before they move on.
I'll never forget just the way, oh my God, how desperately I wanted the main character to sleep.
I know.
Reading the book, just
so did he.
You're just like yelling.
But then
like,
at some point,
for
he
the
was
love
like,
of God, fall asleep.
But then at some point, he was like, "If I do, then I've lost all of this."
Yeah, and it's
and I have he has promises to keep. He has a specific promise to keep that is in the epilogue. Actually,
yeah, it's just Stephen King does a really good job of really that evocative sense that we all know of chronic insomnia. Even having it for just a few days is horrible.
I do think it captures sort of that delirium.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the tone,
because you still have to go on with your day, but like you're not equipped for it.
Well, if you have chronic insomnia like this, you could go into psychosis. And is this psychosis for these characters?
Yeah,
Are we living through their psychosis and this isn't actually happening?
Yeah.
When you see things and have hallucinations, no one else is going to believe you unless they're seeing it too. And then is it the insomnia or is it because these beings are giving them that power? I
did this in college. I did a sleep deprivation experiment. No caffeine, no drugs or stimulants or anything. Just stayed up for, I think, about 50 hours. And I was absolutely delirious by the end of it. I was not like, babbling or anything like that, but my cognitive abilities, it was like trying to think through mud. But I was also talking to the cat and the washer dryer.
I did the same, except it was called finals.
Yeah.
And then I passed out during my African American history exam. Like right at the end, I just hit the table and my test went flying, and my friend Jamie was in the class with me, and the teacher was like, "Are you okay?" And I had finished the exam though.
You could just be, I was just really moved. Yeah. Wow. No, I once had a night terror in a history class. Like I fell asleep and had one of those dreams where you wake up screaming.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was fun in high school to wake up screaming in a classroom, flinging your books across the room. I just chalked it up to Freddy Krueger stalking me.
Yeah. I mean, I passed out more than fell asleep, but still.
It was just a boring class with a boring teacher. And, school is rough.
School's out for summer, though.
So that's
and
Stephen
so are
King.
we.
Stephen King Part 2, y'all. And we're definitely going to be revisiting because the man can't be stopped.
We have more decades to talk about.
Yeah. So I hope you liked it.
Yeah,
I had
absolutely.
Everybody enjoy the rest of your summer. And no, it's still summer. Enjoy the rest of today.
So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Are you trying to shove me off the mic?
No, I'm trying to get us to have a
Like
more
a natural
resolved wrap up.
Wait, I can do it. And that's all, folks.
Oh God, no.
No. And that's the way the cookie.
How about you just say goodbye?
Bye, everybody.
No. After I say wrap it up.
This is complicated.
So yeah, we have more decade plus to talk about, and although my co-host keeps spilling the beans, books to film and TV adaptations. We're also going to explore that. We're going to do it all. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you around.
Insert goodbye. Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Sispanik. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're standing right behind you.